Okay, good morning. I see folks are joining us as I speak. Thank you for joining today's webinar. Before we begin, I'd just like to go through a few logistical issues. First, you will all be muted. Excuse me. You will all be muted as the panel discussion continues. Throughout the panel discussion, you will have opportunities to share in your questions or comments as we go. If you have any difficulties during today's discussion, please chat to the host and she'll respond. And also, as I mentioned, please chat in your questions through the chat as we go through. We're going to be collecting those questions and addressing them at the end during our Q&A period. I also want to just give a heads up for you all to please give us some feedback. This panel discussion on stigma is part of a series of events that we've been doing around the importance of mental health stigma. So we really look forward to your feedback to give us some ideas and your thoughts about other offerings that we can do in this space around mental health stigma or any other topics. And just as a heads up, the recording and the presentation slides for this panel discussion will be available on the CTAC website. We have a dedicated special initiatives page on mental health stigma on our CTAC website that you can go to not only look at these slides and presentation, but other material that we've done in this space over the last year. And then just a quick point, we will provide continuing education credits for this. These are just some slides that we have to do. You can, if you need instructions on how to receive your CEs, you can reference these slides when they're available in 2 or 3 days. I should just note the CEs are available for social workers, licensed mental health professionals, licensed marriage and family therapists, NLPs. So these are some instructions for how to obtain your CEs if you're interested. Before we begin, I just want to mention, to thank you all for joining us for this webinar today, Breaking Barriers, Understanding and Combating Mental Health Stigma Among Children, Youth, and Families. My name is Jim Rodriguez, and I'm the Senior Director of Clinical Initiatives at the McSilver Institute for Poverty Policy and Research, and I'll be moderating the discussion today. And today's panel will focus on, as the title suggests, mental health stigma among children, youth, and families. I just want to mention that, as more and more prominent people come out and talk about their challenges with mental health issues, the issue around stigma might appear to be waning somewhat, but we still have a society in which we often conflate mental illness with violence and aggression and other negative stereotypes that often lead to shame and internalized negative stereotypes around mental illness and mental health. Some folks actually argue that mental health stigma is at least as damaging as the conditions that folks live with. And so it's a really critical topic to discuss. Much of the research and scholarship on mental health stigma focuses on the impact on adults, and even more specifically on adults with severe mental illness. Today, we hope to shed some light on the impact of mental health stigma on children, youth, families, parents, caregivers. We're joined by 4 experts on this topic, 2 peer advocates with lived experience and 2 researchers who focused on the question, on the topic of mental health stigma among children, youth, and families. And what we hope to do is deepen our understanding of that impact on children, youth, and families, and more importantly, address the issue of what we can do to support children, youth, and families to grow and thrive in the face of stigma. Our panelists today are Crystal Rose. Crystal Rose is a family peer advocate. She supports the engagement and training of family peer advocates across New York State as the Family Workforce Development Coordinator at Families Together New York State. Her past work includes onboarding and training new staff, advocating for maternal child health programs as a certified community health worker, and helping families navigate government bureaucracy to receive needed services from organizations. She's also the parent of a young child with mental health challenges. Jay Culkin is a New York certified peer specialist and a youth peer advocate. Jay has spent most of his time as a youth peer advocate, advocating for transgender youth and providing information to staff about quality LGBTQ plus care in mental health settings, using examples from his own lived experience. Dr. Tally Moses is an associate professor at the Sandra Rosenbaum School of Social Work at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Dr. Moses made significant contributions in a number of areas, including the importance of the subjective experience or understanding the subjective experiences of mental health treatment and mental illness stigma among adolescents diagnosed with mental health disorders and parents' problems perceptions, experiences with stigmatization, and coping with their children's mental health challenges. And Dr. Joseph DeLuca, he's a licensed clinical psychologist and assistant clinical professor of psychiatry at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. Dr. Lucas has extensive training in evidence-based assessment and treatment strategies for use in neuro settings, and his research is aimed at understanding intersectional stigma and addressing equity issues in services. So with that said, I want to turn over to our panelists, and we're going to start with Crystal Rose, who's going to share some of her experiences as a parent, examples of how mental health stigma has shown up in her life and in the life of her children and her family, and also what has helped her through her journey. Crystal?
Thank you so much. Hi, I'm Crystal. I'll tell you a little bit about my journey. So, as a parent, I found myself kind of put into this battle where I was navigating some of the mental health challenges for my son in a place where it felt like stigma was misunderstood, and it kind of made it difficult for me to take certain steps. There were a lot of assumptions from my community, judgments from my child's behavior, and I'll give you some specific examples of these things that have happened to me over time. So, my son, he's 11 now, and he's a wonderful young man, doing very well in school. But over the time with him growing up in his childhood, he did have some oppositional defiance disorder as a diagnosis, and he had some trouble regulating his behavior. And so with that, there were some other things that kind of fell into a gray area for him, but his impulse control was something of concern to me, and I was helping him navigate it as his mother, as the person who felt like, she knew him best. But there were times when he would have episodes, and the experiences that I had were didn't have empathy for me as the mother as well as for him as the child. People seeing his behavior, not understanding some of the root causes, where it comes from. We were on a bus, a city bus one time, and he was still very young at the time, about toddler's age, maybe 1.5 to 2 years old. And we're on a city bus, and he is just crying incessantly. And I tried to hush him, and I did everything that I knew would satisfy him. I, gave him something to snack on. I was rubbing his back. I was, doing the sounds that mothers do. I was doing everything that I could, and he just kept crying, crying, crying. And I did not know what I could do to make him stop. And I was beginning to feel a little bit embarrassed, because this is a public bus. I'm originally from Brooklyn, New York. And all I kept hearing while I was on this bus was comments like, I tend to look younger than I am, and they're like, oh, these young mothers, they don't know what to do. Oh, all you got to do is take care of your child. If you don't know how to have children, why are you having one? These are verbal, out loud comments being said to me with assumptions and about a narrative that doesn't exist for me, not knowing how to take care of my child, not knowing how to parent. All you have to do is pick him up. Don't you know how, what to do? And it was just nerve-wracking. It was really heartbreaking to hear and experience that. And I really started to feel anxious. I started to feel anxious. I started to feel like I was failing in that particular moment because I'm like, am I doing something wrong? Why aren't I able to get my child to feel calmer? I didn't know at the time about any diagnosis. He was still so much younger. I didn't know what he was going through. And so I just had this experience that just felt really hard to overcome. But I remember there was a woman and she was a little bit older. She looked like she could have been in her mid to late 50s. And she turned to me and she gently said, "It's okay. I understand." And that one little comment made me feel like I wasn't alone. That one little comment made me feel like, okay, as long as this one person is on the bus with me until I get to my next stop, I can make this ride, and I was only headed to the house. So I'm like, I just have to get home. If I can only get home. And so that experience really shook me up. And that was one of the first of many. I remember having other experiences where family members and friends expected me to simply be able to just fix it. When things would go wrong with him, like, why don't you just fix it? Like, do this harder. Oh, you're not yelling at him hard enough. You're not doing this enough. Deans of the dean of a school would say, I'm sure you don't discipline him. And there were all these assumptions. Even speaking of school, that's another area where the impact of the stigma really began to affect me because I actually reached out to my son's school for further support. And rather than being able to find a place where I got guidance or care, I instead seemed to get more of like more labeling. Like when talked about my struggles with being able to navigate his behavior, feeling overwhelmed and saying, what can we do? I'm willing to work together. What can we do? There was threats of calling CPS on me because his behavior just was something that was so concerning to them that they thought that I wasn't taking care of him at home. And I just began to feel so overwhelmed. And like I said, there was some trouble navigating family support. Not my entire family, of course. There were individuals that I felt were in my corner, but some of the external family members. For example, there was a Thanksgiving where he was playing with cousins and things, and they just were he couldn't understand. He had trouble understanding the social atmosphere, sharing and doing things like that. And he began to break down crying because they had to share a toy. And in his mind, the perception was they took it from me and they will never give it back. And so he broke down crying and he really had some trouble regulating. And it was, oh, you don't discipline him. He's so spoiled. And there was just this lack of understanding, not just of what the diagnosis was for my child, what my child probably is experiencing through his lens and his perception, but what I feel and some of the vicarious trauma that I'm picking up trying to support him as a mother. And I found, in that time, I was beginning to feel very lost and misunderstood. A few of the things that I know have helped to sort of take this situation into a better place for my family and I was finding the proper mental health support. I enrolled him into therapy. I also got therapy for myself. Um, I started to strengthen the inner voice and the self-awareness, knowing that I am good enough. I'm doing the best that I can. I learned to recognize moments of gratitude, recognizing things that are going well instead of hyper focusing on things that are not going well, and also how to find my voice, which led me to becoming the family peer advocate when navigating social serving systems, is like being able to talk to individuals and others of authority over the areas and the environments that my son has to participate in and say, these are his needs and this is who he is. And I know this is your experience, but this is what I know about him. And he can't say this yet. He's not at the age where he's able to sort of advocate for himself. And so I am his advocate. I'm his hero. And being able to take everything that I've learned through the support of therapy and beneficial mental health providers and things like that, and turn them into strengths, create this strength-based language that I can now use with my son and my family, and teaching him as he's going into his preteen years to use for himself. It really helped to support my family and sort of bring us onto the other side of all of this.
Thank you, Crystal. Um, and again, if folks have questions for Crystal, please send them in. We're gonna come back at the end and address any questions that may come up. But Crystal, I want you to I want to thank you for just sharing and giving folks some insights, a really close picture of what it is like for a parent to be raising a child with mental health challenges. I want to shift now to Jay and have Jay share a little bit of his story.
Yeah, thank you so much. So my name is Jay Culkin, and my pronouns are he, him, his. I am the youth training coordinator at Families Together in New York State outside of this. And I just wanted to share a little bit of my, the youth perspective. So here are some photos of me when I was young about the time that I'm going to be speaking about for this panel. So around 11, 12 years old, so I was pretty young. I started to come into my LGBTQ identity, kind of figure out who I am. And that had caused a lot of friction in my household. Even prior to coming out as LGBTQ, identifying myself as an LGBTQ person, I had a lot of little quirks, I guess, growing up, which was we found out later in life autism. I have autism spectrum disorder diagnosed by a neuropsychological evaluation that I got later in life. But for the majority of my childhood and adolescence, it wasn't known. My mother would label me as a strong-willed child and kind of, say anything but, what could be kind of deeper than this. So conflict between myself and my family got worse as I came out as LGBTQ, or I was really outed as LGBTQ. And there was so much non acceptance and so much friction that these symptoms that I was experiencing, these internal symptoms of being autistic, started to come out in more visceral ways, coming out in kicking holes in the walls, screaming, yelling, all these things that got me labeled as this very oppositional kid, this very bad kid, really. And to me, it was just I'm not being heard. I'm being kind of shunned, not listened to. And all of that kind of snowballed over the years uh, as um, an outburst that I had kind of had in eighth grade that led me to be removed from school for 3 months um, with no mental health care. Just kind of the school saying, well, this kid disclosed that, he was really angry and he was feeling some feelings that we feel like he needs to have a psychiatric evaluation for. But instead of sending him to the hospital, let's just let you guys take him home and you figure it out. So I was out of school for 3 months. I missed out on a lot of valuable educational um, material. God knows I still can't do math above like a fifth grade level because of just the amount of time that I'd lost and the fact that there was no catching up. So excuse me. This had kind of again, spiraled into all of this different stigma that I'll talk about a little bit later, um, that affected me, my self-esteem, caused shame and anxiety in my parents. And it resulted in me getting into a situation of teen dating violence and intimate partner violence, um, which I feel was a lot of me trying to cope with, okay, I am not liked. There's the stigma against me, and this person is not stigmatizing me. But they were doing other things that were, abusive and manipulative of my experience as an autistic person, not getting, the care and support that I needed. So here are a few of the pieces of stigma that I feel like I experienced, um, with being autistic and having co-occurring mental illnesses. Um, he's just trying to get out of doing things right. Um, I noticed that also in my work as being a youth peer advocate, people saying they're just trying to get out of it. They just don't want to do it. They're having these outbursts, this, frustration, laying in bed and not wanting to get up because they just don't want to do it. There's underlying situations. And not everybody is willing to go and look for what are the underlying causes of why they don't want to do the thing. Right. So that would happen to me often where let's say I just didn't want to say sorry, right? That's just a little example. Jay just doesn't want to apologize. Jay doesn't want to like consider what he might have done wrong. Oh, I didn't know what I did wrong, and nobody's really explaining it in a way that I understand. So I'm going to keep getting frustrated. People were not taking the time to have those conversations with me in a way that met me where I'm at as an autistic individual. He's just trying to get attention. I would argue the opposite. I was trying to be left alone, right? Every youth is different and they have different needs and they do things for different reasons. Um, he's being manipulative and or selfish. Um, Again, kind of correlating with this, like, Jay always has to have it his way. Jay always has to, at the end of the day, he needs things to go his way. Yeah, because honestly, as an autistic person, if the lights are too bright, if the sounds are too noisy in an area and I have to get out, I can't be there anymore. This is very overstimulating. I'm not just being selfish, I am looking out for my mental and physical health. And I would argue I'm trying to prevent things from getting worse, right? I'm trying to almost self regulate, I'm trying to advocate for myself, intervene, and it was being perceived as manipulative, selfish, not wanting to do things. Um, Specifically in 8th grade, this story that I had told about being out of school for 3 months, I don't want him around my kid, he's a bad influence, right? I was perceived as a bad influence. I was perceived as a bad kid. I was perceived as, I remember an adult, in my life that had been my friend's mother. We had come to trust this family. When there was a bit of conflict, um, this was a mother of my close friend growing up had started to go to other parents and had said, this kid is crazy, he's don't let him around your kids. And I had started to lose friends and experience being bullied because of something that an adult was saying about me through hearsay. And that impacted my social life for years, as a youth who really needed a lot of social support. Um, Something is wrong with him that needs to be fixed. I would argue I don't need to be fixed as a person with, mental illness or a person with autism. My symptoms need to be addressed. Those are two different things. And the last piece I wanted to kind of give was it being a phase or a trend. Um, I know, when my mother was interviewed for my neuropsychological evaluation, one of the things that she had actually said is, Jay tends to, see things online and just imitate them and make things up and whatever. Ironically, uh, being autistic, that actually is what you do. You tend to mirror people. You tend to try to find how to do different social aspects of your life by looking at other people and seeing what other people do, right? And so people tend to do that. They tend to look online, they tend to look for all of these resources. They match up, I have this symptom, I have that symptom. But I would argue it's not always about the phase or the trend or, whatever. I think it's about people trying to figure out what works for them using the resources that they have to figure all that out. And there's a certain level of respect that you have to have for that. Even if that person doesn't have I went on TikTok, I found this diagnosis. I feel like I'm diagnosed with that too. But they relate to the symptoms, and that's the point, right? So I feel like that was kind of my experience was I was relating to certain things and I was saying, look, I relate to this. I saw this online. Give a little bit of the benefit of the doubt to the experience, maybe not the label, but the experience. Um, What helped me? A few things. Acceptance of my LGBTQ identity as an adult. I have a very supportive father. Um, totally a complete difference from what he was when I was younger. And that made all the difference in, my young adulthood. Music, being able to self-regulate. I listened to a lot of metal and rock, and the lyrics really validated myself. It allowed me, to take a break from that stigma for a second, take a break from everything that everybody was saying, and feel heard. Uh, Music's not going to stigmatize me, right? Um, Having some privacy, some space, being able to take the time to figure out what's going on with me so that I don't have to behave in these negative ways that are harmful to myself and others. Um, Sources of information and representation kind of goes along with the social media thing that I was saying. Um, Obtaining information and resources about what I was going through, and my parents having that. I've sent things to my father, has made all the difference in how I present myself, how I advocate for myself, and therefore reducing the stigma against me and people like me. And just where can I be my full authentic self? Where can I avoid the stigma and grow and change as a person so that when I am in an area where I'm maybe more likely to be stigmatized, I also know how to advocate and help kind of dismantle the stigma. So the last piece, here's my it's a few pictures of me now, some hope. I kind of felt when I was young, because of the stigma, I'd never get to these points in my life. Getting a master's degree, that's the one on the far left. I have a master's degree. People seem to think that people like me are not going to get a master's degree. We just don't have the focus. We don't have the drive, whatever. Look at me. Reading my poetry in front of people at multiple open mics. I'm born and raised on Long Island. I've found as many open mics as I can to share my story. Um, and on the right, I perform drag. I was able to lean into my LGBTQ identity, to a point that I'm able to get up and do these things. Actually, me being autistic, I would argue, makes me really good at drag because I'm able to kind of like make these big facial expressions like I'm making now, and it's very entertaining to people. Goes along with the drag, theme. So that is my story. Thank you so much for allowing me to share that, and I really hope to, hear a little bit more from everybody else.
Thank you, Jay. And I just want to mention, both for Crystal and Jay, many shout outs to both of you for sharing your stories. Many folks are chatting in um, uh, the voice that you're giving to and the naming of how crippling and debilitating the anxiety associated with having challenges, having children with challenges is. So many folks are really recognizing and appreciating both of you telling your story. Jay, folks are really sort of impressed with your being able to share the stories of your thriving and your ability to overcome. So thank you both for sharing those stories. Again, we're going to come back and give folks opportunities to bring up questions specifically for Crystal and Jay. Um, in a while. Um, right now, what we're going to do is we're going to now pivot to our two researchers. And we're going to start off by asking Tally to share her thoughts. And to some degree, we're bringing together both lived experience, but also what we know, what the research says, and how well these stories, both of these stories, support and or are supported by what we know, what the research is telling us about mental health stigma among children, youth, and families. So, Tally, I'd like to
I'm
turn it over to
here.
you.
Hello. Hi, everyone. I hate to follow up two powerful speakers, and especially someone with pictures and stories, because the academic piece is never going to be as fun as that or as interesting as that. But it is always great to be in a room where you full of social workers and other clinicians and parents. There's nothing like it. So I'm happy to be here. And a warm hello from Wisconsin. I'm the odd man out in the Midwest. So I'll get started. And I, oops, maybe I can hold these slides. Okay. So I think a lot of the things that I'm going to say have been absolutely echoed by both Crystal and Jay, and and then hopefully we'll have a chance later to tie them all together. So I don't want to spend too much time on defining stigma. I think we all know what stigma is, in the sense of a trait or a condition that is labeled as something undesirable, and something that is then used to devalue or marginalize someone, as we have heard here, both Jay and Crystal. And I just want to say too that at times that trait that is stigmatized is visible, in which, for example, with Crystal on the bus with her son, that was very visible. And a lot of times, mental health and mental illness are invisible, which is it's kind of both good and bad. An invisible stigma enables the people the folks that bear that stigma and the family members to sort of control to some degree information about it. But then what happens is if there's an episode of, there's some needs that erupt, others in the vicinity don't know how to it's an ambiguous situation. You had no idea, and now you don't know what to make of it, and who's to blame, and how to deal with it. So the visibility piece is important. The type of condition can be important too, especially in the severity of the condition. So there's a lot of different things that will moderate how much stigma, what kind of stigma is brought to bear. But we know that the stigmatization for people with mental health issues and concerns extends to family members, absolutely. And we'll talk about of the family members who the parents are the ones that are usually bear the brunt of it, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Irving Goffman, the great sociologist that sort of elevated the field, the application of stigma to mental illness, referred to family members as the wise, meaning persons who don't bear the actual stigmatizing condition themselves, but who, because of their affiliation, association, find themselves, quote, accorded a measure of acceptance of courtesy membership of the clan, meaning the stigmatized clan, and are obliged to share some of the discredit of the stigmatized person to whom they are related. Now, so that is why the literature, anyway, on stigma often family stigma talks about courtesy stigma, and it's a tongue-in-cheek, sarcastic way of saying associative or stigma by association, as if courtesy is a good thing, but we all know that it's not. So that's just I will use the word courtesy and associative to interchangeably. Now, associative stigma manifests in two different ways. The first one way is structural institutional stigma, where you have public policies and rules or procedures or discriminatory actions or inactions that are perpetuated by institutions, organizations like schools, like court systems, that in the case of family stigma, that these kinds of things would result in a systematic exclusion or disenfranchisement of the family. In housing, education, again, in the criminal justice system, et cetera. The other piece that we're going to talk much more about, is the interpersonal or public stigma that I think we've talked about today. And this is interactions with extended family, friends, community members, school staff, healthcare, social service providers, other people in one sort of social orbit. And that's what we'll talk about mostly, and that's what we've talked about already. I do want to mention that with respect to structural institutional stigma, in terms of that level of stigma, it is definitely low, something that all families experience in certain ways, but I do want to mention that lower income families, families of color, families with LGBTQ plus kids like Jay's family, and other minoritized families will experience more of that structural institutional stigma. And to some degree, depending on culture and depending on context, some families will experience more interpersonal stigma, or rather, interpersonal affiliate stigma. Okay. So, of all family members, biological parents bear the brunt of societal stigma when a child has mental health illness. I think more so than, say, siblings or spouses or the children of someone with a mental illness. And I think it's because I think we hold parents we sort of hold parents responsible for children as children's well-being and behavior, as Crystal was talking about, and construe mental parenting as a sort of moral task, whereby parents are held to certain standards for good parenting, and they're judged if they come out short from the perspective of the receiver. But I also want to mention that in terms of parental stigma, so to speak, it's often a euphemism for accusations against the mother, which bears a disproportionate sort of societal expectation for the responsibility of ensuring a child's wellness and controlling a child's behavior. So I do want to mention that as well. But that's a whole conversation. That's for a different day. Some common expressions of interpersonal stigma or associative stigma, we've already heard of, this can be anything related to, judgment, criticism, other derogatory language used to refer to the family, to the parents, gossip, slander, rumors, criticism, pity, unwelcome or patronizing advice, such as Crystal received in various different circumstances, stares in public, and social avoidance or exclusion, even within families where you don't get invited, the family doesn't get invited to go out, or people cut off ties. So those are some common expressions of interpersonal stigma, which make people feel really, really alone. Now, there's a stigma does not occur, co-occurring public stigma or associative stigma doesn't occur in isolation. There's parents also, or caregivers also, experience self-stigma or internalized stigma, which is essentially when Crystal was talking about feeling like a sense of I'm not doing a good job. Clearly, I'm getting messages and I'm not doing a good job, and started questioning herself and the self-doubt. So it's this kind of turning these experiences and these notions about what good parenting looks like onto oneself, and in ways that generate feelings of shame or guilt or embarrassment. Now, most families or family members will experience both associative stigma and internalized or self-stigma. And I do want to say that those are related. However, there's also research that talks about how even when parents don't have specific experiences of public stigma or associative stigma, they still will feel internalized shame, internalized self-blame, even for conditions that other people may not blame them, don't feel like parents have responsibility for, they will still feel. So it's self-stigma is very, very, very nuanced. It's very sticky and hard to get rid of. And that's something that's super common among caregivers. Vicarious stigma is the kind of stigma that is experienced by parents when they feel the pain and suffering associated with watching their child get discriminated against and isolated, and marginalized in their peer group or in their school or another setting. And so that's another type of stigma. And all of this co-occurs with caregiver burden, which is just a general term for the physical, emotional, relational, financial, career, or kind of stressors that kind of create, especially in certain times of heart, certain sort of culminate and burden and create physical health problems and mental health problems, as well as other issues for families. All right, keep doing the wrong thing here. The consequences of courtesy or associative stigma, whether it is real in terms of having specific incidents you can point to, or just a general sense that my child and myself my family are stigmatized, whether it's real or anticipated, are pretty significant, and there's a good amount of research on that. Though, as Jim was saying up front, there is a lot more research about all of this when it comes to parents and individuals with severe mental illness rather than children and youth. But there's, we can think about what the consequences of sort of associative stigma are for kids. And, I think the more, to the extent that that kids are impacted by the messages they receive from their parents, and I think Jay was talking about how important the messages received at home, both the negative ones as well as later the more positive ones from their father, or his father, were really, really meaningful. To the extent that they get these, kind of, a parent who is feeling very downtrodden and diminished and devalued, that's going to manifest for the child in the sense of more self-stigma for them. There must be something really bad that is happening here. I must be a real problem, etc. So exposure, and also exposure to messages from the parent about keeping it down, keeping it concealed, keeping it low. Those kinds of things are going to impact the child's identity. You're going to have more stressed out parents, and to that extent, you're going to have a less sort of bandwidth to be present psychologically for the child, and to be, and for parenting. You're also going to have parents, and this has kind of been confirmed in the research, that when there is more associative stigma for parents, they're more reluctant to seek services. They're more reluctant to follow through with services. So you're going to have a child who is, whose well-being is sort of, undermined, and the capacity and the potential for recovery also that gets affected. So there's a lot of consequences of courtesy or associative family stigma for the child. For the parent, of course, we can talk a lot about this. There's mental health. There's a question of identity and parental identity, and what am I doing? Their outlook on life, and sense of depression, and sense of sort of foreshortened horizon. Their sense of isolation and loneliness is impacted, and general levels of stress. And with, there is literature that suggests that with all that stress, there's accelerated aging. And that's mostly literature focused on parents of adults with severe and persistent mental illness. But okay. And then finally, for the family, there's a question of family cohesion and identity and sibling relationships. There's a lot of implications for the family. I guess I've run out of time. I do want to say shout out to all the providers in the room that, when there is research that indicates that stigma reported by family members often comes from helping professionals, like social workers and clinical psychologists. And these are some of the ways that family members talk about and have talked about providers. And this is something that's really something we need to pay attention to in the field. And it's often very subtle how providers sort of communicate stigma to parents by asking certain questions. I'll just say this one thing about even questions that are normal, typical parts of intake, like, when did the problem start? What was going on in the family, or in when the problem started, and what did you try to do before to try to cope with the situation, and what has worked and what hasn't? All of those questions are totally legitimate. We ask these questions to try to understand context and effect and cause and effect, and what has worked and what hasn't worked. But from a parent perspective, what I've understood from parents and caregivers is that it feels like attack. It feels like you're looking for the blame, that you're trying to you're focusing on my responsibility and all this, and the family responsibility. So I think, just as a point of, I think that there's ways we can ask those questions by prefacing those questions with kind of a context, and try to get the parent to understand, these questions might feel harsh or might feel blaming or judging, and that's not my intention. And you know what? After we ask those questions, I'm going to come back and I'm going to ask you how these questions felt, and whether you have any questions for me. And I want you to know that I don't blame you. I don't judge you, but I'm asking these questions so that I can start putting some pieces together. So I think, but these are some other ways that people talk about their interface with the mental health establishment that are problematic that we really need to pay attention to. Oops. There are lots of ways that parents and family members actively struggle against stigma, and that those capacities will vary to some degree by culture and socioeconomic status and availability of resources. Crystal talks about a lot of these kinds of strategies. In fact, it's almost as if I took her story and put it in little bullet points. I do want to highlight this one thing that is so powerful for families and parents specifically, which is, and this is something mental health providers can really help with, is the connections and friendships with others with lived experiences, other parents and family providers who have similar experiences, similar challenges. There's that power that comes from validation, from sharing of wisdom, from sharing of information about providers and other initiatives going on. And the opportunity to help others who are maybe earlier in their journey with this is so empowering. So to the extent that providers can create those opportunities, refer for opportunities, and create those connections for families, it is a game changer. And I'll stop there. And I'm sorry for taking too long.
No, Tally, and I will say I really appreciate especially your focus in those last two pieces that's so important. And I really appreciate how you balance the two. The need, yes, to collect information, but also being aware of how the collection of that information and how eliciting the story and the history from parents can also be stigmatizing in itself, but also, you enlightening us with ways that you can try to counteract that. In Q&A, I definitely want to get some thoughts from folks in the audience, as well as Crystal and others around, what you think about Tally's approach to sort of asking questions. We'll get to that. So the last person we want to turn it to is Dr. Joe DeLuca. Joe, take over. Here's your...
Perfect. Thank you. And I have to start off by echoing Tally. What a lineup to follow. This has been wonderful. Thank you, Crystal. Thank you, Jay. Thank you, Tally. I'll certainly try to connect some dots as well as I go through this. Again, I'm Joe DeLuca. I'm an assistant professor up at Fairfield University in Connecticut, and also a clinical professor here in New York City through Mount Sinai. And always a privilege to be able to talk about stigma, especially among young people. So a few things standing out for me so far. And again, I'll try to connect some of these dots as I go through these slides here, but just the bus example, right, that you brought up, Crystal, I think that highlights a lot of things. And one thing that stands out for me is just how much public stigma there still is and how explicit some of this stigma is, right? There's still certainly implicit forms of stigma and microaggressions around mental illness, but there's a lot of explicit stigma, right? People talking about mental illness in a negative way and really believing in those stereotypes. And similarly, Jay, I'll touch on some things about how this labeling process starts early, right? Like they're a bad kid, right? There's something wrong with them, really not getting to the root of things. And that process starts quite early, even for kids, sort of how they develop their beliefs around what it means to have a mental illness. So this probably goes without saying for this group here, but among everything else we're talking about, this is a super critical issue because we know that lifetime mental health conditions, the majority of them start during the teenage years and into young adulthood. So really critical period to be talking about mental health and trying to prevent or mitigate the effects of mental illness down the line. And also, as I'll be talking about in the next slide and going forward, a really critical time to be interrupting the stigma process among young people. And unfortunately, this stigma process starts pretty early and is transmitted directly to children and directly perhaps to parents who might be watching shows like this with their kids. So one review article actually showed that films and TV shows made for children and adolescents often portray characters with mental illness as violent people to be feared by other characters or as villains. So what you're seeing here is Cruella in the animated 101 Dalmatians being forced into an ambulance as she experiences apparent hallucinations. If you watch this on YouTube or elsewhere, I think she's talking about like seeing spots, right? So we see this sort of connection of like a villain, a bad character, and having a mental illness, right? And that can become quite embedded, right, from a young age for kids. And building on some of the points of Tally and others, just think back for yourselves in the room here, being an adolescent, whether or not you were struggling with a mental health issue, this is a time of a lot of changes, right? There's puberty, there are peer and social changes. There's also a heightened level of self-consciousness, right? Thinking about what other people are thinking about me. Am I being judged? And the research really shows that, specifically when we focus on adolescents and their understanding of stigma and mental illness, there's a lot of perceived and anticipated stigma, right? Oh, a lot of people in society stigmatize people with mental illness, and adolescents may not be so wrong about that, right? There is high stigma and anticipated stigma, right? If I talk to someone about a mental health concern, maybe my teachers, my peers, my family will judge me, right? And there can be some truth to that as well. But that tends to be pretty elevated for adolescents in particular, right? These worries about what will happen, right, if I disclose or I talk about a mental health problem. And I believe, as Tally mentioned as well, there's this form of stigma called internalized or self-stigma, often used synonymously in the research literature. And that is essentially when a young person, or an adult, but a young person in this case, is incorporating stereotypes in society, right? That public stigma into their identity, right? Maybe starting to believe that they can't recover because they have a mental illness. Or I've heard among young people I work with that, they worry they might be unpredictable or violent, right? Because those are stereotypes they've heard, right? And they start incorporating them into their identity. So it can be really impactful, especially for a young person. That said, we do have some evidence that is, being built up over time that we can target some of these stigma processes, not only on a community or a public level, but also on a clinical level. So I try to touch on both of those along with some gaps in the field. So the best practices, as folks here might know, when it comes to public stigma reduction is, it includes education and contact. And I was thinking about it while Crystal and Jay were talking. They essentially did that for us today. This is kind of like a public stigma reduction presentation, right? We had a lot of education coming out of these talks, as well as contact, right? So a family member, right, lived experience, right, has been through it. And then Jay, right, someone with lived experience, really talking about their story of recovery, what they've been through. And the likely mechanisms for that, probably unsurprisingly to the audience here, is that it can really humanize, right, someone with a mental illness, right? What it looks like to have a mental health condition, what recovery can look like. That said, there are some limitations of prior work in terms of it can be just hard to recruit kids, right? And to get into the school system, for example, to do like public stigma interventions, finding time, in classes to do that. One of the interventions that I want to focus on, and this was the focus of my dissertation, is called Ending the Silence. So this is through NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness. They've got chapters all over the country. And if you want to learn more about Ending the Silence, you can check out their website there, ets.nami.org. And when I was in grad school and working with youth in clinical settings, I started thinking a lot about stigma. And this intervention was just starting to be developed using best practices of education and contact. But as we know, it's always important to be evaluating interventions, right? Making sure they're working well. So long story short, I partnered with NAMI to do the first randomized control trial of Ending the Silence. And again, it was based on best practices to reduce stigma among young people. These presentations were developed specifically for middle school and high school students, right? So an adolescent type audience. And involve two speakers who speak for anywhere from 40 to 50 minutes, depending on the class, depending on the school. And we have one family member who talks about their experiences and talk about education about mental health. And then we also have a young person, right, who talks about their experiences of mental illness, being in recovery. So like I said, it made me think as we were hearing stories from Crystal and Jay, because they would be kind of like prototypical Ending the Silence speakers, right, sharing their stories, talking about education, what they've been through. So we studied this in a sample of just over 200 high school students in New York City, again, with a main goal of seeing, can we reduce public stigma among young people? It was a pretty diverse sample, as you can see here. and addressing some of the other gaps in past research, where maybe it was like a pilot study or just a pre-test and immediate post-test evaluation. We had 4 time points. So we had a baseline or pre-test assessment of youth stigma and knowledge and other outcomes, as well as an immediate post-test, right? Right after the presentation, we assessed people's stigma and knowledge and other outcomes, and a 1 month and 2 month follow-up, right? To see if these effects sustained over time. Half of these students got the Ending the Silence presentations, half were in a control group, and they had an innocuous presentation like careers in psychology. So we didn't expect much to change in that group. And we measured a bunch of different variables, but I'll highlight 3 of our biggest effects here in just a moment. So one main variable was, of course, negative stereotypes, right? So this is people in the general public believing that someone with mental illness might be violent or unpredictable or can't recover, in this case, adolescents in high school. And I just want to orient you real quick to the graph here. So green, that's the ending the silence, right? The experimental condition. Blue is the control condition. We didn't expect much to change there, right? On the bottom, on the x-axis, you could see the time points pre-post, 1 month, 2 month follow-up. And then the y-axis, you could see the score. So we did see at the immediate post-test, right? A drop in negative stereotypes, which is what we hypothesized. But we see that effect really rebounded 2 months out and kind of came back to where it was, right? So I'm happy to discuss this later, but there might be some implications here for maybe like booster sessions or different type of content brought in. But good initial findings, right? The immediate post-test. For mental health knowledge, right? Like, do you have accurate information about what recovery is, what treatments work? The findings were a little better there. We saw an immediate increase in knowledge after seeing the presentation for Ending the Silence, and that it was pretty much sustained even at 2 months. So that was pretty, impressive. It was good for us to see that, okay, this seemed to have a sustained effect even 2 months out on knowledge. And then I want to share a secondary finding, and we call it a secondary outcome because we weren't sure how much we would see a change on this scale. Not many people have really looked at it, but it was something we wanted to test out. And it's basically a help-seeking type scale, and it asked adolescents, how risky would it be for you to disclose, your emotions or feelings to a counselor, right? Which for anyone, but especially an adolescent, could be pretty scary. And this was actually one of our most robust or strongest findings. And we found that um, there was a continuous decline in anticipated risk, even at a 2-month follow-up. So adolescents at the immediate post-test and then all the way down to the 2-month follow-up were feeling like it would be not as risky as they thought it would be to talk to a counselor. So we definitely want to probe and look into that finding a little more going forward. But potentially this intervention is not only having effects immediately on negative stereotypes, longer term on knowledge, but maybe some effects on help-seeking type outcomes. So again, this was for getting at public stigma, right? Addressing that stigma among a group of adolescents and the general public. And this research has been included in recent reviews where they've looked at similar interventions and it found some pretty good effects. So there are other interventions out there. It's not just Ending the Silence, but that's the one I researched and know the best. And of course, there are also clinical interventions, right, that can target more of that self or internalized stigma. So one that I'm quite familiar with, and I believe Dr. Janos, one of the authors of this, has given a talk before as part of this program, is narrative enhancement and cognitive therapy, or NECT. And you check out the website there. And this is an evidence-based program as well, with 3 main elements. It's usually a group treatment focused on psychoeducation, cognitive restructuring, and storytelling, right? So trying to dispel some of the myths around mental illness, think about, how you incorporate mental illness or mental health into your identity, and how that affects your story. So again, we've had some pretty good evidence showing that this can reduce internalized stigma and improve some other clinical outcomes. Excitingly, this intervention is being developed more for young people as well. So there was a recent study for NECT for youth and caregivers. I'm part of a grant right now looking at NECT for young people in the first episode of Psychosis and seeing if it helps young people there, and also families, right? Can we have family sessions where we bring families together to support each other around what they're going through and what stigma experiences they've had, right? Can that be sort of a complement to the intervention for the young people going through this? And this is not an exhaustive presentation, just to be clear, but this is another type of intervention that has been tested with young people, developed by Dr. Pat Corrigan, one of the biggest stigma experts in the field, called Honest, Open, and Proud. And there has been some research with adolescents. This program is a little different to my knowledge. It focuses a little more on disclosure, right? Helping young people think about the pros and cons of how to talk about or who to talk about their mental health or mental illness with. But studies have similarly shown that this type of intervention can reduce stigma stress, improve quality of life, and other outcomes for adolescents. So we do have some emerging interventions, some good studies out there showing that they can really help young people and their families. But just to wrap some things up here, most lifetime mental health conditions, right, they start early, and so does the stigma process. I mean, I've seen studies looking at kids, in elementary school who can sort of associate the term mental illness with negative terms, right? This starts quite early. It does remain prevalent stigma in society. It can prevent young people from seeking care. And even when young people seek care, it can stop them from engaging in care, right? They may drop out early. And of course, being fully involved in their community. But that said, effective programs do exist to reduce public stigma among young people, as well as internalized stigma for youth and families. So I look forward to future research in that area and talking more with you all about some of this.
Thank you all. It's difficult to figure out where to start. First off, I just want to ask our audience, we'll have formal Q&A in a little while. I just want to have a little interactive discussion here with our panelists. But as you think of questions that may come up that you'd like to address our panel with, please chat those in. And as I said, we'll have an open Q&A period with the audience in about 10 minutes or so. I do want to start, actually, I want to connect two things. Tally, I really appreciate what you had to say about the impact and ways in which providers can inadvertently, hopefully inadvertently, promote stigma. Crystal, I wanted to get your thoughts on what Tally presented with regards to that. Well, actually, for both Crystal and Jay, your thoughts about ways in which, because you talked about seeking services, Crystal, and what it took. And actually, Crystal, I'm sorry, it's a two-part question. The first part is, what was it for you, given the fact that some of the stuff that we talked about also speaks to the issue of internalized stigma, right? You carry that. And oftentimes that can be a major obstacle towards seeking services. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about what was it for you that helped you seek services? And then your thoughts about what Tally shared with regards to what providers can do, and that for you as well, Jay, what you've seen. Crystal, I just want to sort of bring you in.
Sure. The thing that made me seek services was really just that the point of exhaustion that I was at. I knew I couldn't go any further. And I knew that the experiences that my son was having, witnessing these experiences, him coming home crying, and sorry, I'm getting like a little choked up just thinking about it, and him feeling like that whole part of internalizing. He had so much language that I'm like, that is not you. So I said, we need help. I said, we need help. I need to do something. And then it hurt a lot to go to the school saying, I want to do something about, I want to do something to help my son. His behavior is getting worse. And they had, names that, oh, he's a bad kid. There were some teachers that wouldn't even get near him because he has this thing with with people getting too close to him, touching him. It makes him uncomfortable. And he kind of like would lash out. And I told them, I say, but did he tell you he didn't want to be touched? Yes. So why did anybody touch him? And then it's like, because he was screaming. And I'm like, there has to be another way. There has to be another way. And then, so yeah, when I went to get support, because I knew that my son was beginning to internalize this and I knew it would change him. And I didn't want him to become someone who didn't believe in who they were and didn't have the confidence to see themselves as a part of a community, belonging anywhere, really. I said, I need help. And yeah, and in that conversation about needing help and also trying to be vulnerable and mention my exhaust and the way that I was feeling like I couldn't show up. I didn't feel like I could, my health started to decline because I was so stressed and overwhelmed. And I was just going through so much things. And it was just like, well, if you don't know what to do at home, we can get CPS on the phone. I'm like, what? Like, why is that the first plan of action? And so, that's the reason why I sought it. And things that I had to do is I had to turn to the nonprofit organizations. The only thing I knew was that there were people that I had seen come up out of their situations of exigence, whatever that situation was distinct to them. And they went to community organizations. They went to people just that had the boots on the ground. And I just knew like I had to reach out to something. And so I went to the community organization, and that's where I discovered about, family prayer advocacy and people who had lived experience, and knowing that, there was another way out, and someone who can say, hey, I've been there, like that lady on the bus, and say, it's okay, you're gonna be all right. And there's a way out of this. That was one of the most beneficial things for me. And really, it was the turning point of our lives. It changed our lives dramatically from that point forward.
Jay, is there anything that you wanted to add with regards to your experience with providers and what helped you seek services or how?
Well, one of the things that came up for me when Dr. Moses was speaking about, the way that parents carry stigma, um, you know, I remember when I was young, maybe about 11 years old, I had actually asked my mother to go to therapy. I want to go to therapy, right? Because I knew things were kind of bubbling up for me. I was a pretty self-aware child for my age. And I remember my mom actually saying to me, I had therapy growing up. If you go to therapy, that means I didn't do my job. Right, and at the time, I was like, "What?" Really frustrated about that, but I think that as I got older, and really, like, saw the stigma for myself and watched other people, around me get stigmatized by that, I get it now. I can kinda give her a little bit of empathy for that. And another thing that had kinda come up for me when we're talking about the way the providers, perpetuate stigma, whether intentional or not, I actually remember one of my psychiatrists that I had as a child, when a autism evaluation was requested, her response was, "Autism is overdiagnosed. Sometimes kids are just weird, but I'll give you an ADHD screening." Um, you know, and I had to sit with that for a long time, just almost like I'm just weird, so I'm just weird. And that full neuropsychological evaluation that I received, really kind of, like, validated that, like, sometimes providers just hold too much stigma to do their job appropriately.
You? And I'm curious for the panelist. I think one of the things that we touched on at the beginning, and Joe, you shared some of the research that's being done right now and trying to address public stigma, public mental health stigma. I want to bring it back. Other thoughts about what we can do to address on a larger scale public mental health stigma. You talked a little bit about the intervention and what that has done and what the research shows the effect of that is. And actually, I wanted to be more specific, Joe. I'm curious that one slide that you shared where there was an initially a downward trend and then a kick back up again. What are some things that we can do to sort of make sure that trend continues to go in the direction we would hope it would go into?
Yeah, yeah, really good question. So, yeah, I think as the name implies from NAMI's intervention, I think they would agree with this too. Ending the silence, that requires consistent conversations and discussions, right? Not just a one-time presentation or, one-time focus on this topic. It's continuous discussions, it's continuous thinking about it. Um, it's partnering more with people with lived experience, not only, as presenters in these talks, but also in the research world, right? Trying to get out of our ivory towers and have more people with lived experience help out with this research, contribute in meaningful ways, and really opening the doors to that. So I think those things can help and go a long way. And then a last point, thinking about what Tally mentioned around structural stigma, thinking about how that operates sometimes even on a clinic level, right? I saw a scale published recently on like structural stigma among clinics, right? Just simple things. What is on that form, that intake form you're filling out in the clinic? How are people greeting you in the clinic? What are maybe what are the signages, on the walls? So I think there are a lot of different ways we can address this, and it definitely requires a multi-pronged and sustained effort to reduce the stigma.
Thanks for sharing that, Joe. And yeah, I think you have all sort of highlighted the very many sort of directions and needs that are out there to address the issue of mental health stigma and on a sort of micro, as we often talk about in social work, at a micro, meso, and macro level, at all those levels in terms of the interactions we have with children, youth, and families, but also thinking about our policies. And procedures. Um, I did want to actually try to open up. Oh, I'm sorry. I just also wanted to mention for folks our special initiatives page. So Joe talked a little bit about two interventions, um, the narrative enhancement in cognitive therapy. We have on our special initiatives webpage, actually, Phil Llanos, Dr. Phil Llanos, who developed or was part of the development of that intervention. We have two webinars on that. One that he did to sort of address and apply NECT for adults, and another one for working with youth. So folks who want to learn more about NECT, but actually look at the intervention and look at what they do in the intervention is critical. And we've also been having conversations with Pat Corrigan, Dr. Pat Corrigan, who's also a preeminent researcher in this space, who helped to develop Honest, Open, and Proud. And we're actually, for folks who are interested in more on HOP, we're actually looking for folks to let us know if that's something of interest. We can actually expand and amplify that work. And he's been looking at doing that work and has others who are doing some work in the space around applying Honest, Open, and Proud for parents and caregivers and for youth. So let us know if this is some more information you'd like to learn about HOP, and we can sort of follow up with that. I'd actually like to sort of turn to the audience right now and see if there are questions that might come up. And Ida, my colleague Ida, who is a family peer advocate, who's part of our team, I know she had a question too. And I think you touched on it, Crystal, but I think she wanted to ask a question about the value of peer work and peer support work. Ida?
I know, with my camera. Yes, one of my questions, I mean, I put it in the chat, but I was just wondering, when you're working with parents and youth, what has happened to be able to break barriers around stigma to support any caregiver or youth in getting services that they need, especially around culture and family barriers to help seek, like the beliefs and about mental health illness and service that could get in the way. Have you ever encountered this? And if so, how did you help them break through the barriers?
I absolutely have. I can remember some distinct families that I've worked with where um, they've had a lot that was internalized for themselves. And I found that in my role, first it requires empathy, but I had to pour in to them. I really had to pour in. And, there's a quote that says, nobody cares how much you know until they know how much you care. I have to first pour into them and connect with them so that they can begin to care about our conversations. And with that, they can begin to believe what I'm saying to them. And then that language comes back around and it begins to mirror the things that they begin to say about themselves and their families. So a particular family that I can think of, the caregiver was really struggling. And I was able to say, listen, and talk about the great qualities, if finding the positive in the situation, if there was conflict with the children. And I'm like, I see that you care, and that's why we're in this disagreement. And then it's like a light bulb moment kind of goes off, and it's like, I thought I was a bad mom. And it's like, no, you're not a bad mom, you're a caring mom, but we have tools to help you, educate or to parent or to whatever. So I think it first starts with caring. It first starts with connecting, empathizing, and pouring in. And then when you do that in an authentic way, then people will begin to mirror that about themselves. And I feel like it helps empower them and develop them. And so that's some of the ways that I've approached that.
Thank you, Crystal. Anything you want to add, Jay?
Yeah, so, when I talk about hope and I share my story and I try to reduce the stigma, when I'm talking about that with an audience like this, I tend to draw a lot of attention to the positives, how I was able to overcome, etc. I would argue actually that when it comes to me working direct service with youth in the past, I've done almost kind of the opposite, where I have talked about the good, the bad, and the ugly. And if I didn't talk about the ugly, and if I didn't talk about, the negative things that happened and the stressors and the, you know, like it would seem unrealistic, and it would only just perpetuate the stigma of I haven't been able to get to that positive point. I don't see that for myself. I must just be one of those bad ones. So when my youth would tell me, the youth that I work with, if the youth would tell me like I just don't like I don't think I'm ever gonna get to a point where I incorporate gratitude and affirmations the way that you do. You say that you do that every morning. That sounds awful to me. And I'm like, yeah, for several years it was awful to me too. I was so stubborn. I was so resistant. I wouldn't, and if I'm talking about that, it almost gives them this like, okay, well, Jay was actually so rough around the edges. I'm rough around the edges. There's maybe some hope that I'll find that for myself. Whatever way I may not be just like Jay, but I'll find the peace and I'll find, what works for me in time, the way that Jay took his time doing it. So I have to really be like truly and genuinely authentic with those professional boundaries still in mind.
Thank you, Jay. I'm going to turn to some questions from the audience, other questions from the audience, and there's some really important ones. Actually, and I asked this question for everyone, but Nicole has a question, and this is an interesting balance. I think when we think about stigma within families, obviously the experience of parents is very different, obviously, from the experience of children and youth. And one question came up. This is very specific. So, how do you validate the caregiver burden without feeding into the child's negative views? And if I may, what I think I'm hearing that right is, the you have a parent and caregiver who's concerned about their child. And in talking about that child, we can often sort of take a very sort of deficit-based approach, and that could lead to internalized stigma for the child, right? How do you balance those two? It's a great question, a really tough one, and it's open to anyone who wants to address it. Crystal, I definitely want to give you your an opportunity to respond first. Those two things are really difficult, right?
They are difficult. I find that, well, there's some nuance to this question because
Hmm.
it really depends on who's in the room when the conversation is happening. So I would think about that. When I was a family care advocate solely, I worked alongside a youth peer advocate. We were like a team. And when there were conversations that needed to be had, yeah, we would initiate the conversations with the family, but we would also separate. And each pair would have a solo conversation to get the truths out of whoever is speaking at the moment. And so, what I can say is, in independent moments with the caregiver, is where you can focus on validating what they're going through. And one of the best ways to avoid feeding into the negative views is to just avoid the negative language. And so you can sort of kind of find the things to the strength in the caregiver's parenting to talk about, and you can sort of find ways to address the things that are going well without, you don't want to be dishonest. You know, of course, you want to be authentic. If there are things that could use some support, it really is just about using the right language, so that they're, you know, you're not talking down to the youth as the focus, or about the youth as the focus. So you really just want to be careful about the language used, the environment and space that you're in when you're dealing with the caregiver, and using those of sort of as a guide. I mean, that's the best way that I can
No,
think of it.
no, thank you, Crystal. Tally, I wanted to sort of get your thoughts as well about this. And Tally, I'm just going to add a little addendum to that question because I think you brought up, as I said, some ways in which providers can inadvertently promote stigma. I'm just curious as well, if you have, if you're aware of any research that goes into, you know, how can providers uh, navigate through that as well, to be and to combat stigma in their interactions. But your thoughts, Tally?
I'll start with this last piece and say that there's surprisingly and embarrassingly little research about provider stigma. It is not, there is some in social work, that's for sure true. There's a little bit more around nursing and medical doctors in terms of their provider stigma. But in terms of psychotherapy and, you know, direct practice with families, that research is waiting to be to be conducted. And I think it's actually a sort of a little bit lack of humility on the part of the treatment community that it hasn't pursued this kind of research. The assumption is that no, not us, kind of. That's my best guess. But I do want to address this question from Nicole, which is a really good one, and it's not an easy one. I think there's a way. I think first of all, as Crystal I think suggested, there's times to do some, you know, there's time and places to do the validation, and it may not be in front of the child. I think, so I think, but sometimes with the child in a conjoint meeting, you know, I think kind of bringing the people to everybody's humanity, including the parents, into the room is really, really important, and sort of a growth experience for the child who developmentally may not have that perspective taking kind of capacity yet, you know, but this, and is not in a place to see the parent as a fully fledged human being with all their stuff, right, and their vulnerabilities as well. But bringing that into the room without overwhelming the child, there's sort of there's a finesse, there's a nuance there that is not easy, and it's hard to talk about that in a webinar. But you can do it. You can do it. Do you hear what your parent is saying? You know, sometimes parents have to be super parents, and that's, or expected to be super parents, and that's not easy, right? You know, that they're expected to do so much. And I think, but I think in terms of the full-fledged kind of unloading and validation, that's something the parent can do with their peers, with peer support specialists, and with people with other lived experiences. That's not something to do in front of the child. So I would say that. But it's not to say that you shouldn't acknowledge the parent's stuff in front of the child in any way. There's just a way to kind of do it in a way that's not as confrontational.
And Joe, if I can get your thoughts, because you mentioned you're a researcher, but you are also a clinician. How do you find is helpful in navigating that balance?
Wow, I mean, I think Crystal and Tally nailed it. The nuance of it, the time and place of it, and you know, just thinking of like NECT, for example, narrative enhancement and cognitive therapy. You know, they've been piloting like these family focus studies, right, with family members of young people with mental illness, and I think that can be a nice place, right, to unload and vent and talk through a lot of this. But I do echo what Ty and Crystal are saying in terms of there can be a time as well in front of the kid, right? Just sort of modeling what that looks like, right? Mom or dad goes through stress too. And correct me if I'm wrong, Tally, this may align with some of your research, like kids pick up as well, you know, if parents are stressed, of course, if they're not talking about mental illness or they're not talking about mental health. So really thinking about the terms we use and how we talk about it and facilitating healthy conversations at home around mental health, mental illness, can go a long way as well.
Thanks for that opportunity to say that, you know, I think it maybe go against some people's expectations, but mental illness stigma for youth happens in families a lot. And not just in extended family, although that's a piece very much so with cousins and grandparents and, you know, different generations, different expectations, but also in the family. And it's very, very subtle, right? And to the extent that parents are feeling stigmatized and vilified, that's going to have an impact on the relationship with the child. It's going to come out in certain ways. So I think bringing all of it into a room together in a family setting where everybody is, you know, sharing, and everybody's sharing some of their experience, especially the parent, and some of their concerns and some of their tension, is a way of kind of calling out the elephant in the room so that it doesn't come out in these untoward kind of ugly ways that, you know, that can definitely happen. Like Jay was talking about his mother who was reluctant to see him go into therapy because it felt like an expression of failure on her part. Perhaps her being in therapy as a child, she remembers what she said about her parents in therapy, you know, and so that feeling of, and I think, but I think, I think that there's a room and a place to do it. I think it's important because family does occur, stigma occurs in families as well.
Thank you, Tally. There's so much. Jay, I wanted to ask one last question, and I realize this is kind of a big one, but I think so important with regards to youth, and that is you used the term identity so many times. You mentioned how really connecting to and affirming your own LGBTQ identity was part of what helped you heal. But I think for young people, identity, we know the professionals, right? Psychology 101, identity is like the central issue for young people to sort of work through, right? Identifying themselves. I'm just curious in terms of your identity development, what has helped you sort of bring together all these aspects of your identity over time? And that's a big one, but I wanted to know if you can give a brief response to that because I think it's just so central to work with young people.
That is a good question. Um, in my experience as a trans person and as an autistic person, I don't think I really came to like really being comfortable in that identity and in those identities together until my mid 20s, honestly. And that actually came from having a therapist with the same, like, being trans, you know, that same experience. He's a trans man, I'm a trans man. Um, and not having that barrier of a therapist trying to navigate kind of playing catch up on LGBTQ competency to a point of like true expert level. Um, you know, I even find, you know, as I'm training and as I talk to just people in general, I'm communicating at like a level like, you know, LGBTQ 501 and they're on 101 kind of thing. You know, and so that having that him having that lived experience that was similar enough to mine kind of overcame one hurdle. Now I can focus on all the other things. So it let down enough barriers for me to focus on that. Unfortunately, that's not always, you know, the case. People can't always they don't have the access to it. People might be on Medicaid and they kind of have to go to the clinic that they have to go to in network and all that stuff. But that is why it is so important for, you know, people to do things like this, go to panels like this and hear voices like this, so that they can at least come as close as they can to that, you know, understanding that identity and already having that competency so they don't have to go look it up, learn as they go, you know, and all that.
Thank you, Jay, for bringing some thoughts and clarity to an issue that I know is a big one. It's a big one. I just want to thank you all. Crystal, Jay, Tally, and Joe for an amazing panel discussion. I wished we had more time. And I realized there may have been other questions that came up. So please, audience, join me in thanking our panelists today. You could do it through the chat. If you'd like, you could do it with your reactions. If you'd like, however you would like. I also want to thank you, the audience. I hope this bit has been helpful to you. I do encourage you all to visit our special initiatives page that has many of the resources that we've kind of touched on. Please, please, please complete the survey that we have, because we want to hear from you. If you want more offerings in this space, if you want training on HOP, if you're interested in training on HOP, please let us know through the survey. And then these are a few upcoming events that we have in this CTAC: treating youth, fire setting behaviors, cross networking and resource gathering for youth peer advocates. Critical, as we talked about this today, strengthening ties, supporting caregivers in developing their natural supports. These are a few of the things that we have coming up. Once again, I want to thank everyone, the panelists, you all in the audience, in joining us today. And please be on the lookout for the slides and the presentation information if you are looking for it within a couple of days on the CTAC webpage. And that's the link to the CTAC ny.org. That's a link to our webpage. And you could also contact CTAC info.at.nyu.edu if you have any questions or want to give us additional or have any additional issues that you'd like to bring up. Thank you all. Have a great rest of your day.